Hello, my name is Annabel Hablutzel, and this is my study on the perception of adopted individuals among non-adoptees. So, my study looked at how children who are raised by biological parents and children who are raised by their adoptive parents are looked at in terms of warmth and competence, warmth being how friendly they're perceived to be, and competence being how smart they're perceived to be. And my design was two scenarios in a counterbalance within subject design, which basically means that all participants saw both scenarios and they had an equally likely chance of receiving either of the scenarios first. So to start off with, for past research, we have Moll, who examined community perceptions of adoption and found that 50% of participants thought that adoption is not viewed the same as biological parenthood. These participants were adoptive mothers who took place in open-ended interviews. He, from that study, also found that 2/3 of them were not pleased with the way that adoption is viewed by the general public. Garber and Gravin were looking at microaggressions, and they found 623 microaggressions across 153 interviews. These interviews were done with adopted adolescents and their families, and some of the microaggressions that were found were assumptions of bionormativity, overly intrusive questions, assumptions of years in an orphanage, and adoption being seen as non-normative. These are not all of the microaggressions they found, they're just some of the most common ones. And then we have Fisk, Cuddy, and Glick, who looked at how people form stereotypes. This is going to be the stereotype content model, which is where warmth and competence come from. So the stereotype content model talks about how groups are perceived to be and how those stereotypes are established. So for example, a group that is perceived to have low competence but high warmth is going to be met with sympathy and pity, and their stereotypes will reflect that. So an example of that would be elders. They're seen to be low in competence, so they might need assisted living or extra help, and high in warmth. They'll tell you their life story. And because of that, they're often viewed by the general public with sympathy and pity. So why is it important to know how people who are not adopted perceive people who are adopted? So there are many adopted children in the United States and many adults who are adopted. And as these studies were establishing, there is definitely a negative perception of adoption, or at least a perceived negative perception of adoption that adopted people are experiencing. And this is something that should be looked at. So for my study, my independent variable was scenario given. So whether the character in the scenario was adopted or whether they lived with their biological parents. And then my dependent variable was how that person was then rated to be warm or competent. And I hypothesized that the adopted child would be rated as less warm and less competent than the child who was not adopted. So my participants were 85 Meredith College students who came from mostly sociology and psychology courses. And specifically, they're going to be undergraduate students. So that's going to be about 18 to 22. And all participants were female, since Meredith College is a women's college. And then I ended up having to scrap 12 responses because the survey taker indicated that they were adopted. So at the end of the survey, I had a question that asked, were you adopted? And anyone who answered yes, their data was removed. So out of the 85 participant data that I actually used, none of them indicated that they were adopted. So for the procedure, participants were given two scenarios, one with Morgan, who lives with their adoptive parents, and one with Quinn, who lives with their biological parents. And these scenarios are virtually the same, except for a slight change in wording as participants saw both scenarios. But aside from whether they were adopted or living with their biological parents, there is no difference. And then participants were asked to a series of 4 questions about each scenario, and they were asked to rate them on a scale of likelihood, either for the question being very unlikely or very likely. So the 2 questions that were important were, what is the likelihood that they have a lot of friends? And what is the likelihood that they make all A's? And then the 2 red herring questions were, what is the likelihood they live in a middle-class family? And what is the likelihood that they are a person of color? These questions were included to help mitigate the social desirability effect. And going back to the scale, once participants were done and they had submitted their survey, I then went in and transferred their data into numerical format. So very unlikely was translated to be 1, and very likely was translated to be 6, and then everything in between fell accordingly. So for my results, I found that the person who was not adopted was rated higher in general than the person who was adopted. So as here we have, the first number on this table is going to be the non-adopted persons rated based on competence, and they received a 4.7 on average. The adopted person rated on competence received a 4.4 on average. The non-adopted person rated on warmth received a 4.9 on average, and the adopted person rated on warmth received a 4.2 on average. So as we can see here, the 4s are going to translate to somewhat likely, but the person who is not adopted, therefore, or their mean is closer to 5, which would be likely, and the adopted person would be closer to 3, which would be somewhat unlikely. It's also important to notice the standard deviation. So warmth had more deviation than competence did. There was more of a difference in what people had rated on warmth than competence. So this is that same data in a figure. And so first of all, it's important to note that this is not on a scale of 1 to 6. This is on a scale of 3.8 to 5.2. So it is a zoomed in look at the data. Here, looking at the figure, you can tell that the adopted individual was rated higher in competence on average and lower in warmth. And then the biological individual was rated higher in warmth on average and higher and lower in competence on average, which is very interesting. So they flipped. So just to reiterate, I found on average, the adopted person was rated lower in warmth and competence. And going back to the stereotype content model, a person or a group of people that is rated lower in competence and lower in warmth will be in turn met with disgust. So this data would suggest that adopted people are viewed with disgust at a greater rate than people who live with their biological parents. And as we saw in some of the studies I talked about earlier, for instance, Mall's study, the mothers in that study indicated that their children were often spoke about as being from questionable origins or having bad blood was a common phrase that was used. And Garber and Gromit talked about those microaggressions and that assumption of non-normativity, which is that idea that it's not normal to be adopted. So both of those studies did suggest that feeling of disgust, or at least a negative feeling or connotation associated with being adopted. And what could be done in future research? So first of all, more participants would definitely be a good idea, and a wider range of participants. So since all of my participants were from Meredith College, there's going to be more similar backgrounds than if you were to take a survey from the general population of the United States. So it would definitely be important to get a wider range of participants. For instance, you would want to include men or people who are from older generations might be important. And then also more scenarios or a longer survey. I only used one adopted person and one person who was living with their biological parents. So it could definitely be important to include more scenarios with more adopted people, more people are living with their biological parents to see if that changes the data. And then finally, research on the outcome is definitely important. It would be important to figure out whether adopted children actually feel like they're being treated with disgust, or whether that is an inaccurate reflection of how they actually feel. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.